Let's begin. Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Minister Tani, DG Dr. Ngozi, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you, and welcome to our conversation on the trade, global economy, and climate change nexus. Our starting point today is that international trade cooperation is vital to address one of the greatest global threats facing the planet. That is climate change. The objective of our conversation this morning is threefold. Firstly, we will discuss trends shaping global trade. Secondly, we will explore how trade can contribute to climate action. And thirdly, we will examine the role the 13th Ministerial Conference to be held in Abu Dhabi in February next year can play in ensuring that global trade delivers positive outcomes for people and planet. It is my pleasure to moderate this panel and to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. We have today Trade Minister Excellency Tani Al-Zewoudi of the United Arab Emirates and Chairperson of the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference. Welcome, Minister. We have WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Thank you, DG, for this wonderful setup and the public forum that's kicking off this morning that I know is going to go very, very well. We have to the left of the Honorable Minister, Ms. Pamela Cook-Hamilton, who is the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. Welcome, Pam. We have, last but not least, to the extreme left of myself, UNCTAD's Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Pedro Manuel Moreno. Pedro, welcome. To start the conversation, I would like to request our speakers to share their views on the main trends shaping the future of global commerce and the role of global trade hubs in fostering global trade growth and shaping an inclusive, sustainable, and open trade agenda. You have 3 minutes each. DG, what in your view are the main trends shaping the global trade of the 21st century? You have the floor, DG.
Well, thank you very much, GC Chair, and it's very kind of you to moderate. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the public forum. And thanks to Minister Al-Zewoudi for being the brain behind the panel. Very quickly, I think there are 3 trends that I see. The first has to do with geopolitical tensions that are obviously shaping the way that global trade and commerce is happening. We've got the tensions that we see between the US and China, between Russia, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. We have other tensions between different world power centers, even tensions between developing and developed countries, South and North, to some extent. But I think the biggest source of tensions is the tensions between US and China. And I do think that these geopolitical tensions have an impact on the shaping of trade. What has happened during the pandemic and the war in Ukraine that exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains and the heightened tensions that we see have led people to question whether the patterns of trade we have today, whether globalization itself is the way to go. And the tensions are leading to a conscious effort to reshore, to friendshore, to change the way that supply chains are currently configured. As of now, the figures on trade do not yet show evidence of the geopolitical tensions having great impact. We still have a tremendous amount of trade between the US and China, over 690 billion. Figures released by the Commerce Department for last year. Between EU and China, over 800 billion. Total world trade at 31 trillion. So we don't yet see the impact. However, this trade is based on past investment patterns. And what may happen is that with these tensions, we may see a shift in investment patterns, shifting investment in certain sectors like technology, high technology end products, semiconductors, and so on. And that may change the way that trade in certain sectors is configured. rare earths and minerals, semiconductors, other types of products. So that's one thing we need to watch out for. We are seeing in recent trade data, few glimpses of this, but we need to watch out for that. We certainly do not want fragmentation arising from this, because that would be very costly to the world. So it's something we need to watch. That's the first. The second is digitalization. I think that digital trade is the future. Digitally delivered services trade is the fastest growing segment of trade now, growing at 8% per year, and faster than growth in goods trade or even services trade. I think we are going to see continued growth in this sector. It's worth about 4 trillion now, out of 31 trillion in total trade. That's one thing shaping, and we should support and back that, because it does help MSMEs and women. I think the third thing, very, very quickly, is climate change. Climate change, we think, is going to shift comparative and competitive advantages, and that will change the patterns of trade. We see places that used to produce, let's just take agriculture, one type of product. Because of drought or floods, they may no longer be able to produce that, and that may be produced elsewhere. And we need to watch that, because we will need trade to equilibrate and make sure that, wherever food is produced, it gets traded around the world and people get fed. Let me just leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, DG. That is an excellent expose of how you see the trends at the moment. Let me now move to His Excellency Minister Thani of the UAE and chairperson of our 13th Ministerial Conference, and ask you, Honorable Minister, what in your view is the role of global trade hubs in fostering global trade growth? You have the floor, Minister.
Thank you, Ambassador. Assalamu alaikum. Very good morning. It's really a pleasure to be in the public forum. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for the invitation and for the excellent arrangements. When it comes to the global trade, we've been seeing this movements globally in the last 2 decades. Things have been progressing, but in the last 3 years, fragmentations start picking up, especially when we start exposing nations during the pandemic, the conflicts and the tensions that is going around the world, and even the preparation for the future. Unfortunately, the foresight of the trade is not clear, and it's creating a lot of uncertainty globally. So it puts a lot of pressure on many of us to ensure that we're bringing the unity and the inclusivity back to the track which we want to see things moving forward. When it comes to the trade hubs are very critical part of the global trade, and without those hubs, we will not see inclusive and equitable access to supply chain. Supply chain is it's not just about the commodities that moves from one part of the world to the other. It's about the raw materials, the inputs, the job creations. When the whole raw material starts to be either mining or the initiations of those resources to the factories, to the countries which does have the capabilities to do the factories, and then the whole process of shipments to the world. We have to ensure that there's the right accessibility to those commodities to ensure the continuous growth in terms of the investments, the services that we want to have it into the globe. So trade hubs can offer global connectivities, and the existing trade commercial networks are an evidence of that. Logistical infrastructure, either investments or ensuring that we are expanding whatever is there to ensure that we accommodate the high demand that we're seeing globally. And for sure, the supportive services associated with this global trade hubs, like the finance and the insurance, to continue the momentums on the growth that we would like to see. And for sure, the smart and digitalizations that has been asked for And digitalization is not a simple word. It's not just that we want to do and convert our process to digital and we just do it overnight. It needs the willings. It needs that we do a major transformations on the capacity building and ensure that the people are accepting the changes that is going to happen, and they move on a real and very pragmatic and deployments of the technology wherever they are. Let me switch and speak about the UAE. When it comes to the connectivities and network, we're connected to 400 cities around the world in terms of the airports, ports, and borders. We're having an investments in more than 250 ports around the world, and that gives us very strong logistical network capabilities. On the marine transportations, 2.4% of the global ocean containers goes out from the UAE ports, and that shows how we are critical into this global trading hub and networks. That is linked to one of the topics which is very dear to my heart personally, the re-exports. We're the 5th largest re-export hub in the world. And in terms of the quick numbers when it comes to the re-exports, 27% of our foreign trade numbers in the first half of this year is re-exports, which is around the overall amount of our foreign trade exceeded $300 billion. Because of our re-export capabilities, we became the world's leading re-export of rice. We don't produce rice. We're the 3rd largest re-exporter of diamond. We're the 3rd largest exporter of gold. We're the 4th largest exporter of coffee. And our tea goes and reach 154 nations around the world, and we don't produce tea whatsoever. And shows how critical the global trade hubs in the UAE and how we are becoming a real player on that. Let me switch quickly on how we're becoming and how we're seeing the world and how we're going to move forward when it comes to trade hub. The world is becoming more fragmented, as Her Excellency Dr. Ngozi mentioned, but we're going the opposite. We're signing more free trade agreements. We signed in the last year and a half 5 comprehensive economic partnership agreements with India, Turkey, Indonesia, Israel, and Cambodia. We're signing one very soon with Georgia, and we're going to conclude another 6 before the end of the year. Shows that the free trade agreements are going to be one of the main tools and factors to ensure that we continue in our leadership when it comes to the global trade. On the trade technology, we do have an excellent models. Few things with that we're doing the whole custom clearance before the containers and consignments reach the UAE ports. One of them is Al-Maqta' platforms, where clearance is done in the source nations, and it gets the whole and full services before the containers reach our ports. Another trading platform that we did is Dubai platform, where many of the commodities can be sold directly to Africa easily from the UAE and goes directly to the consumers. Shows that there are so many other examples around the world, but what we want to do here, we have to capitalize on those platforms, use it, utilize it, and we expand so we ensure that it reaches the consumers who needs those services. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for sharing those perspectives from the UAE. I think a lesson I'm taking now is that you don't have to produce things to export them. So this is, I was writing notes vigorously in that regard, wearing my Botswana hat when you mentioned diamonds. So, Pam, Executive Director of the ITC, I think this is a good moment for you to come in, because you are, of course, as ITC, very active in the SME space. And I just wondered if you could share with our audience what some of the factors to consider in shaping an inclusive trade agenda, and what small businesses need to fully utilize the opportunities offered by the multilateral trading system. You have the floor, Pamela.
Thanks so much, Ambassador, and it's really good to be here. Thanks, Dr. Ngozi, for once again pulling off an amazing public forum. The room is still pouring in with people, so it's always great to have this opportunity to converse and to share our views. Let me just start by saying that, you know, the concept of a just transition has to be inclusive. And once we understand that fundamentally, then I think that will influence how we see things. And an inclusive transition looks at women, youth, marginalized communities, indigenous communities, and others who've been ill-served or not been served by the system. So we need to be in a position where we're able to invest and understand what the realities are for SMEs that are women-led, youth-led, indigenous-led. And why? Because if we understand that 2/3 of all global jobs are by MSMEs, one, 2/3 of, or 70% of the global GDP is also due to SMEs, then to leave them out of the conversation is probably one of the worst things that can happen. And so we have to find a way to raise their voice, to bring them into the conversation, and to give them a seat at the table. Because if we do not do that, we then continue a process where we're operating in silos and we don't have all the voices at the table. One of the major needs for the SMEs is this. At the end of the day, they know that they need to make this transition. They understand very clearly. What they need is the information, because if they're not aware of it, they can't make the transition first. They need the skills, and this is a major factor for many of the SMEs. They do not have the broad skill set that's needed to help them do this transition. The third thing is technology. While we talk a lot about the transition in very generic terms, we don't look at the fact that the technology that will be required to make this transition, especially in the area of climate smart agriculture and in the area of, the reforestation, all the issues that are going to come about in this just transition, technology will be needed. And then the fourth is finance. Who's going to pay for it? And a lot of the discussions, of course, on loss and damage, etc., are going to be about who pays and how do they pay. So I think those are the main elements that are important. So at the end of the day, capacity is the biggest need, the single biggest need for SMEs. How do we engage them in a way that allows them a seat at the table? I think it's important also to note at this stage that the environmental regulations and standards that are being promulgated to bring about a climate-friendly trade or to ensure that we have sustainable trade are important, and they have a valuable role to play. But they also increase exponentially the pressure on small businesses to meet these requirements. And as a result, many of the small businesses will begin to fall out of the supply chain unless they're able to meet the requirements of these new regulations. And so we have to find a way, first of all, to translate these regulations for them to understand what is required. Secondly, put in place the technical assistance required for them to meet the regulations. And thirdly, also enable them to diversify. There was a very interesting statistic, about Jamaica and the banana situation. And I say this because it's important when rules change for people to understand what actually happens. In 1966, Jamaica was one of the largest exporters of bananas. 188,000 tons from an island, very small, but we were one of the biggest. We actually helped introduce bananas to Costa Rica and Ecuador. Jamaica in 2022 exported 900 tons. That's it. The banana industry, in effect, is dead. And we can say that for most of the rest of the Caribbean. The rules changed. And the adjustments needed and the investment needed and the financing needed did not come. And so what we want to try to avoid is a situation where changes take place, and those changes are good. The intent is good, but the impact may be negative for them. So how do we do this? How do we ensure that we put in place the mechanisms? And I think it's very important that we acknowledge this. I know that a lot of small businesses are already doing agroforestry changes. They're doing, regenerative food systems. They're also doing renewable energy for small grids. But they need that financing and they need that specific attention so that their needs can be addressed in the context of this global conversation. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for reminding us that in the final analysis, this is really about people. And and making a difference on the ground. And I know that the ITC is working very much on the ground with small businesses, and the ideas that you just shared are ideas that will move much of what the DG and the Honorable Minister identified as some of the trends, but also make sure that they cascade down. Whatever rules are changed or adopted. That Jamaica example is mind-boggling. So thank you for sharing it, because I think we can all learn from it. I will now turn to Pedro, Mr. Pedro Manuel Moreno, the Deputy Executive Secretary General of UNCTAD. Pedro, what do you see as the trends shaping the future of global commerce, and how can we ensure greater integration of developing countries into the multilateral trading system? You have the floor, Pedro.
Thank you, Ambassador Molokome. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for having us, and congratulations to you and your team for such an impressive lineup and for the exciting and, most importantly, relevant discussions to come these days. It's really a pleasure to be here. Coming to your question, moderator, there are different trends already shaping the future of global trade, with implications for the developing world and their integration into the multilateral trading system. They go from the rise of digital technologies that reshape what we trade and how we trade, trade regionalization fostering closer economic integration amongst members, the reconfiguration of global supply chains partly accelerated by COVID-19 disruptions, and greater concerns for sustainability in our world under the threat of climate change and environmental degradation. Given the time we have, let me just focus on the risk of further economic fragmentation, because the price that we may pay for fragmentation is huge. Actually, estimates from the WTO and the IMF point to potential losses ranging between 5 to 7% of global GDP. This is, so that you can dimension it, this is like erasing the economy of India and Italy from the world. So from wherever you see it, the cost is huge. The fragmentation will also erode the international cooperation we much need to address our global challenges. And let's be frank, this will have huge implications, especially for the developing world. And this is because when national security and geopolitical considerations move to the center of the trade policy, multilateralism and the development agenda take a toll. We all know that. Developing countries risk being caught in the crossfire of trade disputes or face growing pressure to take sides in economic conflicts. Nobody will win from it, but most especially some, especially the developing world, will lose more than others. We are all aware that the world needs more resources to recover from the cascading crisis that we have all analyzed and assessed, accelerate the pace towards the achieving of the SDGs, and fight climate change. But fragmentation results in less resources and in less cooperation. So we would be moving in the wrong direction if we don't take this into account. On top of that, Dr. Ngozi pointed that at the beginning, the climate crisis is now at the forefront of all policy discussions, including this one too. The increasing interdependence of climate change and economic development is shaping the future of trade. More and more countries, both developed and developing, are committed to transforming their production to reduce carbon footprints. Trade then must be one of the engines of this transformation, but fragmentation and less cooperation, again, are sand in the engine. Above all, because reducing CO2 emissions and adapting to climate change requires, as we all know, massive amounts of resources, better and more green goods and processes and technology transfer. And this will not happen without trade or with a fragmented trading system. This is why our best bet today remains a multilateral trading system that is fair, transparent, inclusive, and that delivers on the development aspirations of the developing world. And I will leave it here for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Pedro, for sharing that perspective from UNCTAD, and to thank you and UNCTAD for the role that you play in, enhancing the role of developing countries in the multilateral trading system. I'm really happy, DG, that we have here on this panel not just the host of MC13, but also partners, UNCTAD and ITC, and this is a very good example of agencies in Geneva working together to make sure that their various aims and objectives come together to make a difference for people and planet. And on that note, let's move quickly now. I was not very strict on the time with the first round of questions. I will be a little bit more now, so I'm going to ask my panel to be a little briefer. I thought when we open, it's good for you to lay your ideas out in a little more detail. So the second round of questions, we're going to have 3 rounds. Quick second round is the role of trade in climate action. We're getting closer to the focus of this conversation. So I'm going to invite my speakers, my panel, to share your thoughts on how trade can support global efforts to reduce emissions and deliver sustainable trade and livelihoods, and how COP28 can promote trade's potential to drive clean energy adoption, scale up climate-friendly goods and services, decarbonize supply chains, and create new opportunities. DG, I know you have views on this one. Please, let's hear from you.
Well, you said we'll be brief, so I'll just try and restrain myself, because I strongly believe that we cannot get to net zero in 2050 without trade. Trade is central. We cannot transfer green technologies from where they are made, green goods and services from where they are made to where they are needed. So you really cannot decarbonize the world without trade. That's the first. I also think that trade agreements made at the WTO can play a critical role. Let me just take a couple of examples. You know, the government procurement agreement. Many people may not know we have this agreement where, you know, we try to open up and bring good governance into the way government procures goods. People also don't know that government procurement is $13 trillion, 13% of global GDP. Imagine if you use the power of government procurement to force green procurement, so that when goods and services are, being offered, you develop criteria so that those who are participating will only provide these goods in a way that leads to less carbon and lower carbon emissions. So we can actually use some of the instruments we have now and the power of the market to try and drive down the decarbonization, drive down carbon emissions and decarbonize the world through procurement practices that we build in. This is huge. $13 trillion worth of goods and services, we can use it to drive to green procurement. I think that another example of an existing agreement we have that can help is the Trade Facilitation Agreement. We're trying to digitalize trade. The Honorable Minister spoke about it. And there's a study that shows that, if you can go from paper to paperless trade and try to digitize, you can reduce the carbon footprint by 63%. So why don't we try to use this agreement to push faster and actually get our countries to fully adopt paperless and digitized trade. So these are 2 existing examples that are there that we could move on. But let me end by saying that, look, I do not believe, again, that we can adapt to climate change without trade. We wouldn't have the goods and services we need from one place. We see what is happening now. Unfortunately, with the earthquake in Morocco, the floods in Libya, fires in Canada and Greece and elsewhere. We can't move the goods and services and technology needed without trade to help these very places where climate is a problem. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, DG. Very clear. Let me invite Honorable Minister Tani to address this climate action side of things.
Ambassador,
Minister.
if you allow me, I will take 1 minute to speak about the main focus which we're going to do on COP28 before answering the question. There are 4 main pillars that the UAE presidency are going to focus on during the COP. The first one is fast-tracking the energy transition, which is very critical. We want to ensure that we triple the amount of renewable energy contributions into the global power supply. Second one is the fixing climate finance and ensuring that the commitment is going to be pledged, the commitment is going to be transferred, and some of the transformation is going to happen to the financial institutions to accommodate the high demand from the emerging economies and the least developing countries with more practical, more realistic interest rates to those renewable energy and clean energy projects. The third one, which is going to be one of the pillar of the presidency, is the focusing on the people, lives and livelihoods, and adaptation is going to be one of the main important pillars of the focus. We're going to ensure the inclusion of health for the first time in COPs, where we show the impact of climate change on health of people. And the fourth one is the inclusivity. We want to make sure that COP28 are going to bring everyone around the world on board when it comes to the being part of the solutions into the climate change. Now we'll switch to answering the question. We're going to be, as again, joint forces with WTO, UNCTAD, ICC, the World Economic Forum, as well as Abu Dhabi Economic Departments, and hosting for the first time a trade day as part of the main programs during COP28. Through that, we're going to really start speaking about the reduction of carbon footprints when it comes to trade in general. Her Excellency Dr. Ngozi mentioned the main aspects. Let's simplify the impact on the link between climate change and trade. The investments itself. So many are asking for more clean investments, and you cannot do clean investments without ensuring the supply of the needed materials and equipment to those projects. We had some incidents during the pandemic when countries closed their borders. Many of the renewable energy projects slowed down because they couldn't get access to the right commodity and the right equipment to those projects, and many of the projects got delayed. And that is a simple example of how critical the supply chain to the investments in clean energy. When it comes to the investments in clean energy, we have to ensure that there is commodities are produced to supply and to trade. And without clean energy going to those factories will not ensure that there is a less carbon footprint products are produced in those nations. And let's look at the big industries globally: steel, aluminium, coppers, etc. Those industries are highly consuming power industries, and they need a huge amount of power. If we really want to decarbonize, we have to ensure that we are supplying them with the right and the cleanest energy possible to ensure that they're producing the quantities and the volumes that they're contracted to. I'm not going to speak about green procurements because Her Excellency Dr. Ngozi already touched on that. But the second aspect, after the production, how we're going to ensure that the logistics are clean, how we're going to use digitalizations, how we're going to ensure the efficiency, how we're going to ensure that we're using the shortest routes to reach the destinations and where the consumers are. And this is where the creativities and the technology are going to play a role here. We're joining forces with the World Economic Forum and a Trade Tech Initiative, where we're going to bring some of the expertise and practices on this. With that, I will stop here, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister, and congratulations to the UAE for showing exceptional leadership on trade and climate as chair of the 13th Ministerial Conference of the WTO and host of the COP28. I don't think that there's any doubt of that nexus because of the way you have explained this connection, very clear, and I'm happy that our audience here is hearing from, if I may say so, the horse's mouth, who's going to be hosting both these events. Let me move back to you, Pamela, and invite you to share with us your thoughts on how we can better include the voices of small business, ensuring a just transition. I know you've addressed some of this already, but let maybe focus in the second round on how you do that and support climate action at the same time. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Ambassador. Yes, we spoke about this in the first question, a little bit about the capacity constraints. And I think what's important to recognize is to this room and Geneva, we tend to think of trade in theoretical terms. We talk about trade. Once we recognize that trade is not theoretical, then we begin to look at the levers that affect trade and how those apply to climate change and new regulations. So one of the things that we launched last year was a green moonshot. And this green moonshot was basically aimed at how do we translate the various rules and the emerging issues that are coming about because of climate change and the need for sustainable development into concrete measures that will enable small businesses to make that transition. That is the translation that we have to make. And one of the things, we launched the Climate Smart Network in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. We signed with the U.S. State Department. And this is a network of small businesses that have already met certain green standards and that are already in a list of green suppliers, so to speak. We also launched a climate competitiveness assessment tool, which essentially looks at the level of competitiveness and compliance of companies and how do we enable them to become more competitive in the context of green trade. How do we make sure, as the minister was saying, that in the logistics, how do we ensure that these companies are actually meeting the green requirements? How do we ensure that they're not removed from the supply chain? Because these are very practical issues that will arise. So for us, we look at about 5 areas, I would say. The first is a voice. And one of the things we did last year is we took 5 small businesses to COP to actually display and talk about how they had incorporated climate smart agriculture, climate change requirements, new standards, and how they had put that into their businesses and how that adaptation had actually increased their ability to access new markets, especially organic markets, how it had enabled them to lower production costs by using green energy, how it had allowed them to also increase their productivity because the cost, for example, of electricity in Jamaica is 42 cents per kilowatt hour. In a oil country, it's probably 7 cents. And so the differential when you move to alternative energy should not be discounted. That voice is important for us to continue, and I'm really thankful to the Minister and UAE for including a trade day this year in the COP, because that allows the voice of small businesses to be heard in the context of a broader conversation. Thirdly, what we'd like to ensure is that the trade policies that are emerging, and we've been working with, of course, Dr. Ngozi and UNCTAD on this, that the trade policies that are emerging are actually taking into account the impact on small businesses and helping them to make that transition. Finally, I think what is important here is while improving the climate competitiveness, we also facilitate access to finance, access to the technology, access to the kind of lobbying that will be required in terms of the change, but also importantly, as happened from the example with Jamaica, is access to diversification, because not everybody is going to be able to stay in the industry that they are, and we have to be realistic about that. So how do we also help them diversify into new areas? Artificial intelligence is now coming as a huge behemoth. And I think the combination of the artificial intelligence and the climate change needs to be looked at as an integrated whole, because one is not going to move without the other. So those would be my comments on how to work with small businesses.
Pamela, for sharing with us the ITC's efforts in bringing the voices of small businesses to contribute to global climate action. And importantly, I think, in your answer to that second round of questions, very practical examples of how to show this nexus, this link, not just in theory, but also in practice. Let me just now turn to DSG Pedro. Could you share with us some of the takeaways from UNCTAD's analytical work on trade and climate and some of your ongoing initiatives at UNCTAD? You have the floor, Pedro.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me just focus on 3 main takeaways. First of all, the need for a just transition. We have been all mentioning this. We all know that climate change is inherently unfair, and we all know that the decarbonization will follow different paths in the developing world, depending on countries' resources and productive capacities. So it is not with punitive measures that we will accelerate their transition, but instead with support of trade-related decarbonization as the goal. For example, with the technology transfer and sharing the intellectual property as committed to in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and something that we all know that remains unfulfilled. Moreover, and critically, developing countries need access to adequate climate finance. This is actually at the center of our research now. This means scaling up massively climate finance and ensure that it is additional finance and does not crowd this finance out other development finance. Before COVID, we estimated that $2.4 trillion of annual financing for developing countries are needed to deliver both climate and development goals. With the cascading crisis, this number is now higher, but the bottom line remains the same. We need to move from billions to trillions. And this is not a minor issue, especially in a context where global debt has reached record levels. You know that we in UNCTAD, we host the UN Global Crisis Response Group, and this group highlighted that debt is now a burden on global prosperity. Around 3.3 billion people, 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on health and education together. Imagine the limitations they face to invest in a green transition. Second, the second takeaway would be to foster green structural transformation in developing countries. The market for environmental goods has been expanding rapidly. According to our data, international trade in environmental goods reached in 2022 an unprecedented level of almost $2 trillion, or 6% of world trade. This is more than $10 billion compared to the previous year. But increasing trade in climate-friendly goods and services is not enough for an inclusive transition. The transformation must enable developing countries to develop domestic and regional green supply chains. The transformation must also help them to break away from their traditional role of exporters of raw materials and importers of climate-friendly goods from developed countries. And the third takeaway would be aligning the trade and climate agenda of multilateral processes. You mentioned, Ambassador, the need to work together here in Geneva from the different angles where we cover trade. And while the Paris Agreement does not mention the world trade, we are today in a very different situation. This year's COP will feature a trade day, as you mentioned before, and we will have a joint WTO, UNCTAD, ITC, ICC pavilion. This platform is an opportunity that we really have to take advantage of to showcase synergies between trade and climate policies and what trade can do to achieve our climate ambitions. Our coming World Investment Forum will also highlight the interconnectedness of climate issues, with placing the energy transition and investment for green transformation at its core. This offers an opportunity given that developing countries need renewable energy investments of about $1.7 trillion each year, but attracted only 544 billion in clean energy FDI in 2022. While investments in renewables have nearly tripled since 2015, most of the money has gone to developed countries. Only 2% only has gone to Africa. This is an important challenge to be addressed, and let me take the opportunity, Ambassador, to thank Minister Tani for hosting the Investment Forum, and of course, I take the opportunity to invite you all to participate.
Thank you, Pedro. I think that to many of us ambassadors sitting in this room who are credited to all three, WTO, UNCTAD, and ITC, we now, if we didn't know this before, see the interconnections between these three agencies and how they can begin to deliver for our people. Because in the final analysis, it's all about development. This is what the whole game is about, and I think all three agencies are in the business of development. That is why we are members, and I'm very pleased that this panel is bringing this connection so clearly to all of us, not only between what the organizations do, but how we must go about making sure that we attain that objective of reaching the promised land of development. We're going to go quickly to the third round so I can give you a chance in the audience to ask some questions and make some comments. That is the road to the 13th Ministerial Conference, MC13, my favorite subject, and that of the DG as well. And now that of the Honorable Minister, who's hosting the 13th Ministerial Conference. You will recall that when I sat in the chair at the last GC meeting, I outlined this journey that we will be traveling, and that I hope we will all be traveling together to make sure that the 13th Ministerial Conference is a success. So this third round, very briefly in less than 2 minutes, if each of our speakers could explore the role that the conference that we are so much looking forward to, MC13, can play in ensuring that global trade delivers positive outcomes, not just in our regular routine WTO work, but positive outcomes for people and planet. Because as I keep saying, this is what the game is about. DG, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and I must thank our host, the UAE, for taking this on. I'm excited about MC13. I know it's not going to be easy, but neither was MC12. But I mean, no one believed MC12 would deliver, but members came together and they delivered. And I want to seize this opportunity to thank them and thank all the ambassadors and say, I'm trusting you, we're going to deliver MC13. I know you said the road is full of potholes. But our job is to fill all those potholes along the way, and I know we are going to do it. I just came from the G20 leaders, and the spirit of support was excellent. So if we can't deliver at our level, then it's on us. So what are the things that we need? Quickly, there are 3 or 4 areas. One area is on the WTO reform, which is very, very important. With the ambassadors here in Geneva working on what we call, normal reforms, reform by doing, things that we can change that will make it easier for small countries with limited capacity and so on to participate in the work that we do. But we have some other big reforms. We have a deliberative function that we want to see in action in Abu Dhabi. Maybe for the first time, we'll give ministers a chance to take on topics like trade and climate, and engage with each other in trying to work out what are the deliverables down the line that we could have from this engagement, to work out with each other some of the knotty issues along the way. How do we talk about decarbonization of industries? How do we talk about carbon pricing? How do we talk about some of the ways that trade can really contribute to net zero? So another is taking on difficult topics like industrial policy and subsidies, engaging on that and trying to talk to each other, and exciting things like inclusion. How do we get women in trade to be made substantive in such a way that we really see numbers of women who are engaging, increasing, and MSMEs, what Pamela is so seized on. So that's on the deliberative side. Those are just some of the areas we might look at. I think the big reform issue there will be the reform of the dispute settlement system. And how do we work on that to make sure that we show the world that we are trying to listen to the way this system needs to work better. Already some very good work is ongoing right here in Geneva, and we hope we'll bring something to a sizable slice to fruition at MC13. Then we move on to development. The Ambassador Molokome, our GC chair, spoke about delivering for people. And developing countries need to feel that the WTO is making it worth their while to be members, that we need to deliver more benefits to them from the agreements here. So we have to look at some of the issues, the LDC graduation, how do we work on that and make sure that LDCs are supported when they graduate? How do we deal with some of the other demands of the G90 and make development and special and differential treatment really count for developing countries? And another area is the negotiations function. So we have some multilateral agreements ongoing. The fisheries subsidies agreement, phase 1. I see Ambassador Santiago Wills here in the audience who worked so hard. We've done it. We need to ratify it, and I'm happy to say that members are coming forward. Now when I see ministers, they tell me, we're doing this, we're doing that. This is where we are on our ratification journey. We hope to have it ratified by MC13. We need to conclude fisheries. 2, this is for people and planet. If we do not get the sustainability of our fisheries and our oceans, we're missing in action, okay? 50% of our fisheries is overfished. We cannot continue that way. Agriculture, we need to deliver food security is so important. What are we going to do to break through and show people that this organization can make progress on that particular front? Digital trade. We have an e-commerce agreement that we need to look at, the e-commerce moratorium, to see how this can help support digital trade going forward. And then I know I'm exceeding my 2 minutes. You can see I'm quite excited. And then we have Other areas, we are working on some plurilateral agreements. We have an investment facilitation agreement with 110 members negotiating how to remove the barriers in front of investment. This is so important. We have a services domestic regulation agreement to try and take away the barriers in front of services trade, which is also part of the future. We are looking at these as how can we finalize these agreements. So it's not only on the multilateral side, but also on the plurilateral that we have some exciting things. I've listed so many things. If we get 3 or 4 of those done, that's a successful MC13, and I can't wait.
There we go. Round of applause for the DG. I'll let you go on, DG, because I know that that list is in your head and you keep reminding us. And as GC Chair, I just want to say that you do give us this energy, but in the final analysis, clearly, it is us members. It's up to us as members to deliver, to fill the potholes in the direction of Abu Dhabi. And I'm going to ask Honorable Minister to come in here and say, how can you help us? Instead of waiting, I suppose, until we arrive, because we are busy filling in potholes, we might get to you late. What is it that as members we can do, and your role as a host? What are your expectations? Tell the room. We don't want to disappoint you, so.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me just start by saying, next time I'm not going to sit next to Dr. Ngozi in any session.
What have I done wrong?
Well, I want to add to what Her Excellency Ngozi highlighted or listed on to the outcomes, the accession, the new members who were expecting to join the WTO is sending a very positive message that still the organization is a momentum for global trade and bringing everyone on board. Comoros and Timor-Leste is in the final stages. The process of the graduations of LDCs is another critical matter. And the third one, which is very important, is the agriculture and food security, because we saw how important that during the pandemic. And we want to make sure that we do a major breakthrough after 20 years of the negotiation on such topic. The expectation from our side as the host of MC13 that we want to remind everyone that trade is a powerful catalyst for developments. Let's look at the global reports, global organizations, statements when it comes to the protectionism. Based on the World Bank statements, the protectionism is causing more than $211 billion if we're going to continue with the same mindset. IMF says that nations who are more liberal and more open to the principles of free trade agreements are having much faster growth in their economy in comparison to those who are in protectionism or isolated in their policies. So we have to see the best practices which has been there for the last 20 years and how they managed to reach this level and how can we replicate this in more modernized way. What we are expecting from the member states that they're becoming more flexible. They look at the bigger picture, not at the short term. And from my engagements with the ministers in the last few months, and even in close coordination with Dr. Ngozi and Ambassador Sebastian, things are very positive. Countries are sending very positive messages, but we want to bring everyone on board here. We know that sometimes the ambassadors here in Geneva are looking at the technicalities and trying to do their best to protect the interests of their nations, which is a fair and very legitimate role that they're playing here. But when it comes to the bigger picture, let's look at the long term. Let's look at how we're going to grow all together rather than ensuring that we're distracting or disturbing our neighbors and our ally for the self-interest. So the expectation is very high. What we want to do is we want to go there together and for the benefits and the added value for the future generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that guidance and a very clear path that you are charting in terms of your expectations. I think the DG will be elated to hear this. Pamela, in a minute or so, what are your expectations? at the ITC?
Thanks so much,
We
Ambassador.
don't want to disappoint you, so tell us.
Yes, yes. Actually, I was going to say, following Dr. Ngozi and the minister, I might as well cede my time and let's just, poor Pedro is at the end. So, but anyway, let me just quickly say, there are a few things, of course, which translate, and I think that that's what's most important. If we look at the gender discussion, you chaired the first informal working group, and it's now become an embedded part of the WTO discussions. There are 128 members, 7 observers. It is a fantastic example of how a subject that pretty much was nobody wanted in the WTO is now in. And I think what is happening is that perforce, the WTO is changing, because it has to now begin to acknowledge the various elements outside of the normative rules, looking at MSMEs as well, the informal working group on MSMEs. How do we support that as ITC to ensure that it addresses the issues that MSMEs face, both in the context of the WTO and then translating that into tangible outcomes? E-commerce, how do we look at helping in terms of the digital space? The amount of work that ITC is doing in connectivity, in helping countries and especially SMEs make the transition to digitalization. We've now actually brought on an AI strategic advisor because we recognize that artificial intelligence is going to completely change how information is shared, how access is received. And I think the decision by the G20 on the upgrading of the Global Trade Help Desk is a real testament to the WTO, UNCTAD, ITC, and the work that has been taking place, and the need to translate that even further so that we don't get lost. And then finally, just looking at the issue of climate. 30 years ago when I was here and climate was mentioned, not even climate, environment, people screamed holy murder. There was no way that environment was going to be discussed in any way in the context of the WTO. And here we are, having a full-fledged panel on climate change and the impact on trade. And so the way the WTO reform, in a sense, is happening even without us reforming it, because that is the nature of the beast. And so I think it's really also important to recognize how the WTO has already been responsive to what has been taking place, but how ITC and UNCTAD and others can work together to ensure that that responsiveness translates into actual engagement and benefit for the people. Thanks.
Thank you, Pamela. Pedro? Last
This
word.
is actually very complicated to come last on this round of questions. I won't repeat because Dr. Ngozi, expectations are high, as you know, and I'm sure that you'll deliver as always on these. But I will summarize on 2 main asks. One is, and I'm here with Pamela too, use the momentum of urgency of climate action. I think that has to be one of the main angles and the main focus of the discussions. And the second one is the development nexus. You mentioned that, Ambassador, at the beginning, and Dr. Ngozi summarized it very well on the different angles that development affects trade and vice versa. The blue economy, fisheries, digital transformation, food security, that now is a major issue for most of our members, and the inclusiveness, gender inclusion, women inclusion, and trade, that we have proven, all the advantages and the inclusiveness that generates. So I would say that those 2 main asks would be from the developing world, for sure one of the main aspirations, and I will leave it there because the agenda is high.
Thank you so very much, Pedro from UNCTAD. It is now time, ladies and gentlemen, to give you the opportunity to say something. I believe we should be either having a roving mic, or we have these mics here at our tables. Can you just raise your hand? I know that the Secretariat is very good at identifying hands in the room. Please tell us when you speak who you are, which institution you represent, before you say something. I see a hand right there. I don't know if Secretary, you're going to be helping me. I've only seen one hand so far, straight on. Please take the floor.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Wen Huaji. I'm from University in China. I have a question to Director General Dr. Ngozi. We do hope that, and we believe that we can have a very successful MC13, and with outcomes on several issues you just mentioned, although we don't know which issue. But in the meanwhile, we are aware that different countries or different members, they have different interests and concerns on different subjects. We can get harvest on several of them. But as the Director General of the WTO, I think it's very important that we can have a more balanced progress on many other issues, especially those issues that developing countries have concerns, some traditional issues such as agriculture, subsidy, reduced trade barriers. And so what's your idea, or what do you think that the WTO should do to achieve such kind of balance, not only on success on some issues, but success on more wider a range of issues? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to invite a couple more questions, comments from the floor. I see a question right there. Please come in.
My name is Anil Bharadwaj, and I am Secretary General with Federation of Indian MSMEs, India. We are a group of a network of 743 MSME associations reaching out to close to 2 million MSMEs. ITCCO is spot on the needs of MSMEs in, with regards to the discourse in green trade, like information, skill, technology, and finance. But my question is to the DG WTO, that how does she look at new proposed measures educating and dispute settlement functions outside WTO, especially some of the measures that have been proposed in European Union? And such measures may undermine the gains of Uruguay round, especially for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to take a third question. Lady there, let me take you. Come in now.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you so much, all the panelists. I'm Jen Narunga. I am from Uganda, working for an organization called Siatini. The issues being raised are very critical, especially understanding the linkages between trade, climate change, MSMEs. Those linkages are not easy. And my question is, there's a lot that needs to be done at national and regional level to be able to bring the issues together, but also to bring the actors together, the ministries, the MSMEs, the people working in agriculture, working in climate change. So there is a lot that needs to be done at national and regional level. Way back, there was what they called GTAP. That program helped build capacities and bring together the various actors. What I'm asking today, what are the plans at national and regional level to build that capacity in those key issues? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Shall I take one more question before I revert to my panel? I'm kind of left-eyed, so I'll take you, and then I'll take the last, that hand there, and then we'll go to our panel. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruth Nagash. I'm from Eritrea, and I'm the CEO for African Women in Trade. And I really like the panelists this morning as they hit every agenda that we're working as African women work on the ground to do the balanced nutrition on food security, but also very involved at the grassroots level to make sure that the climate awareness is come to action. So the DG has said you can't go green without trade. That is very true, and I'm interested to know what UNCTAD and ITC are doing in the sense of fisheries specifically, because the fisheries sector in Africa has not been tapped, or if it's tapped, it's not properly included in the nutritional values. And I really like the re-exporting idea that the minister has done, and I'm interested also to hear how could we re-export the fisheries that we have as we include in the balanced nutrition agenda in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Last question for this round.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you to the panelists for your very insightful input. My question is to the DG. In the panel, I heard about structural economic transformation. Now, in the context of Africa, the challenge of climate is a challenge of economic transformation. So within the context of the WTO, what kind of rules, especially in the trims, that we can relax to enable developing countries, especially African countries, transition in a very green way? You know, so what are some of the provisions we can relax in those agreements, in those rules, so that countries in Africa can actually transition? Because the challenge of transition is about a challenge of structural economic transformation in a green way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm going to go in reverse order and ask you, Pedro, you want to come in quickly on some of the questions asked by the audience?
I would maybe start by the question coming from the lady from Africa on what needs to be done. I think that the national, the regional levels, I think that this public forum and the initiatives that we, the international organizations, are taking forward is one of the ways to go. Reinforcing multilateralism at the end of the day is from our end what needs to be pushed for and reinforced. DG Ngozi has been very vocal in the many fora that we have been participating, as well as UNCTAD, as well as ITC, of course, as well as our partners at the member states. We are trying to move the agenda forward and try to bring these discussions to the highest level, to the G20 recently in India, to many ministers meeting, to our different fora that we have. And I'm sure that MC13 will be a breakthrough on this as well. So I think that the first step is to agree on the multilateralism as the way to go, and push our member states and partnerships to move the agenda forward. We have been also working on the food security angle that some of you have commented as well, as one that links to fisheries, that links to many other aspects of the question that you have raised, agriculture, as we have seen that now hunger is becoming again on top of the agenda of the developing world as a result of the many different crises. We have studied that in the Global Crisis Response Group, and we are now having hunger back at the top of our priorities. And of course, this is also trade related, and we will have to look closely on that. I will leave it here for the moment, Ambassador.
Pedro, Pamela?
Just quickly, sorry. Water. Yes, sorry about that.
I can skip you, Pamela, if you want to get your voice back.
Yeah, you can skip me.
Okay. Minister.
Sorry.
Let me start with the question on the fisheries. It's not only the fisheries, but also the agriculture, because both are heavily untapped when it comes to the resources from Africa. We're a nation, and the whole region heavily dependent on importation of food. 85% of our food comes from abroad, regardless if it's vegetable, fruits, grains, or fisheries. And we're managing to have all type of foods in the country, in the region, throughout the year. Basically because of the network and connectivities that we built, and the standards that we're having as well. We don't want to bring any very low quality products to our people or the people who are living in the country. So it goes back to you guys in Africa. You have to set the standards. You have to ensure that you really move on the real implementation of those policies, and ensure that you're giving it to the right people. Many of the people are not having the intention of having the development's impact on the nations rather than their own revenue that they're going to generate to their companies. So that's the whole package that I'm going to refer to. Are we bringing fisheries from all over the world? Absolutely. But it goes back to the processes and the process industries that we created in the country, and from there we're growing up on the fisheries. So it's all up to the vision and the real implementations of those policies and visions in the country. Goes back to the last question, which was what are the right policies to ensure that climate and the policy. It's not only WTO. There are many members within WTO who, during the accessions, they accepted and did so many things, but that they did it for the accession purpose. They didn't do it for the development of their nations. Many of the policies are already there in the accession process that you guys, many of your nations already signed to when they joined WTO. But it goes back to the reality. You guys have to start implementing such policies and commitments that you did it in the accession, because that is going to bring investments, that's going to bring talent, that's going to bring the right financial capitals to the mega projects in your nations. So it all comes back to the real implementation of whatever we promise. We're coming from a country where wherever we take internationally in terms of commitments, we do it. And we ensure that it's done in very strict timeline. Otherwise, what is the added value of joining those international organizations? So now I'm taking some of the loads from Dr. Ngozi, but it's not WTO policies and regulations. Let's go back to us as a member states. We have to walk the talk, and we have to start implementing whatever we are accepting and we sign to. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to go quickly back to Pamela, and I'm going to leave all the rest of the questions to the DG. Yes. Many of them were for you, DG.
Exactly. Just on two questions. One, the African women in trade, it's very actually laudable. I didn't really realize there was an African woman in trade. So that's good to know, because we have a very strong presence through our She Trades initiative across Africa. And in terms of the engagement, not just in fisheries, but in agriculture and across the board, I think one of the key elements is how to use the African Continental Free Trade Area as a lever to make this happen. I think it is one of the greatest opportunities that has been created. And I think it is important that this works, because it will completely change the dynamic of African trade, of intra-African trade. It's the lowest of all regions in the world. And so how do we take that massive opportunity and translate it into food security, into increased trade, into increased economic development, all the aspects that can be addressed through integration and utilizing the best of what Africa has. I mean, I could go on, but that's my basic point. On MSMEs, and I think it was you mentioned the EU regulation and how these would possibly impact. I think one of the points I made earlier, and I think it's important to recognize, that taking a decision to pursue climate action is a legitimate decision in and of itself. There's nothing wrong with it. I think that's important to recognize and to acknowledge, that every region, every country has that right to decide how to try to get to the climate ambition. One of the things I've said to my son before when he says something that upsets me and I respond, I said to him, the fact that you didn't mean to stab me doesn't mean I haven't been stabbed, right? At the end of the day, you didn't mean it, but I still have a wound. And I think this is the translation problem. A lot of times there are regulations, and it is happening with the EU regulations, which are going to come in by 2025, January. We have 18 months and the clock is already ticking. How do we work with the EU and others to put in the accompanying measures for these countries and SMEs, especially the smallholder farmers? Honduras has 100,000 of them in the hills doing the coffee. Who is going to make sure that they meet the requirements and make sure that they are still part of the supply chain at the end of the day? All of these things will be required as part of the methodology to assist countries to meet these requirements. But it does not take away from the fact that the promulgation of the rule or of the regulation is right or is correct. It is a question of how it's applied and then what accompanying measures can be brought on to make it work. Thanks.
Madam DG, the floor is yours to mop up the other questions.
Yeah, don't chastise me if I take a bit of time, since there were so many. I'll try to be fast. The first one was on, and panelists have really given excellent answers. I want to thank you. You know, the first one that I want to tackle is different from our Chinese colleague who asked about different members and their different interests and how to balance this in the agreement. The way I look at it is, I approach it somewhat differently, and I say, what was the WTO set up to serve? And if you go back to the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement, it said this organization was set up to help create employment, to enhance living standards, and to support sustainable development. Many people don't know this. Please go and look at this. This is all about people, okay? It was set up to serve people. So when I approach things, I don't say, well, how do I balance this member and that? What I ask is what we are doing serving people? So for me, it's not a question of balancing interests. Yes, in practicality, you have to do that. But the question is, what are we delivering and is it serving people? And so that's what we should be asking, and members should be asking themselves. The minister mentioned the issue of short-term interest and national interest versus longer-term and the overall good. I think what happens sometimes is in negotiations, of course, everybody wants to fight their corner. That's understandable. But at the end of the day, negotiation is also compromising, realizing that, look, if we want to really serve people, I have to give a little here, give a little there, and at the end of the day, we come up with a package that serves people. So that's how we go about it. And I think the fisheries subsidies agreement was an exercise in trying to get people to look at what is the big goal we are trying to achieve for people and the world, and how do we go about it. And I think we managed to get an agreement that stops illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So yes, balance, but please keep the objective in mind. I think the next thing I want to comment on quickly was the issue of the climate and the MSMEs and their interests. I think Pamela gave an excellent answer. I only want to supplement this by saying, yeah, I totally agree, countries should try to get to net zero, but don't let how you get to net zero impede other countries or businesses from also getting to net zero. And I just want to add that at the G20 meeting, this just came back yesterday, we actually had an excellent conversation with the president of the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen. And she was, I say excellent because she really listened. There has been so much feedback on some of the EU regulations, so we gave her that feedback. And what I want to report to you is that she received it well. She was very constructive. She said the legislation has passed, but they'll look at the implementing regulations. They will try to talk to, consult more, you know, to get more views and also explain why they are doing what they are doing and how they are doing it. I think these are all positive, constructive indications that the EU wants to engage and make sure that this is done right. So according to her, they are setting up the mechanisms to try to do this consultation and reach out in various regions of the world. They are going to be looking at the implementing regulations to see how this will actually impact. So I think that's very promising, and we will keep talking to them here, both at the WTO, but I was impressed by her attitude. I hope it will translate into really doing those things. And then quickly on to the question by our colleague from Uganda, who asked about bringing people and organizations together and building capacity. This is a very important thing, because if we want implementation and action on some of these critical areas, we need to help strengthen civil society, strengthen governments where they ask for capacity building, you know, in order to be able to take action on climate change or any of these areas. It's not only a thing for government, by the way. Private sector has to come in. Civil society, it's an all of society engagement. So we do understand about capacity building. We don't have tons of resources at the WTO. As I go around, the demand is so high. So we work with ITC, with UNCTAD. I hope you've seen the way that we are now, collaboration has really changed among the trade hub in Geneva. And I'm really enjoying working with Pamela. I'm enjoying working with UNCTAD, with Rebecca as well. And you know, it's working. So we will put our forces together to try to see where is the capacity building needed and how can we leverage these resources jointly instead of separately. We're already doing that. We also join with other international organizations that have money, like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, talking to them where the capacity building is needed, how can we join with them so that they can put financial resources. We actually have a pilot program ongoing now for digital trade with the World Bank. So we will do as best we can. And then I think finally the question from our colleague who asked about the structural transformation of the continent as we go green. That is such a vital question. You're right. What is needed on the continent, or the main problems, are structural. They are structural in that we need to really diversify our economies. The continent has been very focused on export of commodities, for instance. And so we're very subject to volatility of prices internationally. When prices go down, our economies don't do so well. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we diversify away from a commodity-based type of economy in almost every country? And the smart question you asked is, can we diversify and go green? And the answer is absolutely. That is how we should be looking at it. We should be asking ourselves, you know, there is one smart phrase that our chief economist, Ralph Osser, talked about. He said, you know, countries have been producing according to their comparative advantage, what they're relatively good at. That's what they produce and trade. He says now we have to look at what we're relatively green at. So we should ask ourselves on the African continent, what are we relatively green at? And there's lots. We have solar. Some of our countries are already showing the way. Egypt and Morocco have massive solar investments. We can do that. We can even manufacture solar panels. I believe we can develop the comparative and competitive advantage, not just to import and produce, but to also manufacture and industrialize in the process. We can do green hydrogen. We can change the way we do agriculture to be greener. We can do rare earths and have them processed on the continent so we can supply the rest of the world with what they need to make the world go green. I could go on. You can see this is something I love. I think Africa has the opportunity to structurally change and go green. I rest my case.
And so the case rests, ladies and gentlemen. I know there were a couple of other hands. This has been such an engaging panel. It's been so enriching to hear from our panelists. I'm afraid I have the terrible responsibility of closing the proceedings of this panel, but all good things come to an end, and I'd like to thank all of you, DG, Honorable Minister, and Pam and Pedro, for your insightful comments, discussions from the floor. Thank you very much. This is what the public forum is about. I'm so pleased that all the questions came from stakeholders, from universities, from NGOs, from business associations. So thank you again for coming. I know that there are so many other things you could be doing, and you chose to come here. Before I close, let me just quickly say a couple of things. We have heard that different factors have been shaping global trade. We need to keep abreast of the evolving trade dynamics to ensure a more inclusive, transparent, and open global trading system. We've been reminded this is what this is all about. Let's not forget. Secondly, trade is an essential pillar of our global response to climate change. We need to keep exploring how trade can work better for people and planet. We heard everybody say that. And for the trade day at COP28, we heard that this provides an opportune platform for ensuring more integrated trade and environment. So there's a continuum here. After this, Abu Dhabi, COP28, MC13. It's all happening in the UAE. Thirdly, MC13, which I must say, in my capacity as chair of the General Council, we have a long agenda, but it's an excellent opportunity to strengthen the WTO, build on the outcomes and key areas of our work, and to provide a forum for ministers to discuss the world's most pressing trade priorities. I remain committed, Minister, to working with you, the Secretariat, the DG, leading the charge in delivering an MC13 that is successful and delivers for people and planet. The progress we make at MC13 will serve as a springboard for reinvigorating the WTO and boosting trade and sustainable development worldwide. Thank you very much to the UAE. Thank you to the audience. Our session is now closed. Have a successful public forum.
Sorry. May I just ask you to give a resounding clap to an excellent moderator and GC chair?